The gate was sealed before I even woke up, and that's how I knew this wasn't an accident. When I stepped outside that morning, coffee still warm in my hand, I saw the chain first thick, new, unmistakably intentional. A bright red HOA notice was bolted to the metal, stamped with authority and confidence, declaring the entrance officially closed due to non-compliance. It was written as if the decision had already been accepted, as if I would simply read it, sigh, and step back inside like I'd been taught to do. But something about that seal felt wrong. Not just unfair wrong. Neighbors slowed as they passed, pretending to check their phones while watching closely. A few stopped altogether. No one spoke. The silence carried weight. Everyone in the neighborhood understood what this meant. If the HOA could seal my gate without warning, they could do it to anyone. I read the notice carefully. No citation. No specific violation. Just a vague reference to community authority and temporary enforcement. Temporary, of course, meaning as long as they wanted. I tried the gate anyway. It didn't move. Solid. Final. The HOA had clearly invested money and effort into making sure I stayed on the outside of my own property. That wasn't a mistake. That was a message. I took a step back and looked at the gate as a whole, not with anger, but with recognition. I knew every weld. Every hinge. Every mechanism hidden beneath the surface. I remembered the day it was installed, years before the HOA expanded its reach. Back then, this land had boundaries, not committees. The gate existed for one reason, to protect what was mine. The HOA didn't know that story. They hadn't asked. They'd seen a structure and assumed control came with proximity. They believed a seal was the same as ownership. My phone buzzed with messages. Neighbors asking what happened. A board member requesting cooperation. No one asked permission. No one checked records. They didn't think they needed to. I set my coffee down, took out my phone, and started documenting everything. The seal. The notice. The chain. The crowd watching quietly from a distance. Because I already knew how this would end. They thought they had closed something permanently. What they didn't realize was that the gate had never belonged to them in the first place, and sealing it was the mistake that would prove it. By mid-morning, the seal had become a spectacle. A small cluster of neighbors gathered across the street, drawn not by drama but by curiosity. They didn't shout or interfere. They simply watched, arms folded, phones out, waiting to see what would happen next. The HOA thrives on quiet compliance, and this kind of attention made them uneasy. The HOA president arrived just before noon, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge. 2 board members followed, walking in step, confident in the way people are when they believe the rules are on their side. She didn't greet me. She didn't ask questions. She pointed at the gate and announced, loudly enough for the crowd to hear, that the matter had been resolved. I asked her to explain the violation. She flipped through her clipboard, scanning pages she clearly hadn't read closely. Unauthorized structure, she said. Community access interference. Broad phrases. Flexible ones. Designed to sound final. I asked when the structure became unauthorized. She hesitated, then said the HOA had always maintained authority over entrances. That was the moment I knew they hadn't checked a single record. Authority had become a habit, not a fact. One of the board members added that if I attempted to remove the seal, I would be fined daily. Another mentioned potential legal action, delivered casually, as if it were routine. The crowd shifted. Someone muttered. A phone camera rose higher. I stayed calm. Calm unsettles people who expect resistance. I asked one more question. Can you show me the document transferring ownership of the gate to the HOA? Silence. The president frowned and said ownership wasn't the issue, control was. She spoke like those two things were interchangeable. They aren't. I told them I would comply with any restriction that was legally theirs to enforce. I just needed proof. Not opinions. Not assumptions. Proof. They promised to follow up and left, satisfied they'd asserted dominance. The seal stayed. The notice stayed. The crowd stayed longer than expected, then dispersed slowly, conversations carrying down the street. I didn't touch the gate. Not yet. I went inside and pulled out a folder I hadn't opened in years. Installation permits. Original invoices. HOA correspondence from before the expansion. Everything was there, exactly where it had always been. The gate wasn't shared infrastructure. It wasn't community property. It wasn't subject to their seal. And by sealing it, they had documented their own overreach. Sometimes, the fastest way to expose false authority is to let it put everything in writing. I waited until the afternoon sun softened and the street filled again with movement. Timing mattered. When people believe authority is acting, they pay attention. When they believe it might be wrong, they record. By then, word had spread beyond curiosity. This wasn't gossip anymore. It was observation. I walked back to the gate slowly, folder under my arm, not to confront anyone but to confirm something in plain sight. The seal was still there, heavy and confident. The HOA notice hadn't changed. No additions. No clarifications. Just certainty frozen on paper. I knelt near the hinge housing and brushed away a layer of dust. Years ago, when the gate was installed, I'd insisted on redundancy. Not because I distrusted people, but because I trusted systems even less. The visible chain and padlock were never the true control point. They were deterrents. The real mechanism was internal, mechanical, and documented. I didn't touch it yet. I just looked. A neighbor across the street leaned against a mailbox, pretending to scroll while watching carefully. Another stood on a porch, arms crossed. No one spoke. Silence does strange things to confidence. My phone buzzed. An email from the HOA marked urgent. It said they were reviewing documentation and advised me not to interfere with the seal. The language was less firm than before. Less absolute. That told me everything. They were searching for proof after acting, not before. I opened my folder and checked the pages again, even though I already knew what they said. The gate predated HOA jurisdiction. Ownership had never been transferred. Maintenance responsibilities were mine alone. And buried in the language was a clause that made all the difference: any enforcement attempt without verified ownership constituted unauthorized restriction of access. I smiled, just slightly. By sealing the gate, they hadn't asserted control. They had violated it. I stood up and stepped back, letting the moment breathe. Power doesn't like patience. It reveals itself when it's rushed or watched. A car slowed. Someone rolled down a window and asked quietly if everything was okay. I nodded. "It will be," I said. I still didn't unlock the gate. That wasn't the point yet. First, I wanted the HOA to realize the mistake on their own. Real understanding sticks better that way. Another email came in before sunset. Shorter. Less confident. It said the board was seeking clarification and would update me soon. No threats. No deadlines. They were discovering the detail they never verified. And once they understood what the gate really was, the seal wouldn't last much longer. By the following morning, the seal felt less permanent. Not physically, it was still tight, still heavy, but in the way people approached it. Neighbors no longer whispered. They stood openly now, watching from driveways, from sidewalks, from behind open garage doors. Authority loses its sharpest edge the moment people stop looking away. The HOA president returned just after 10, alone this time. No clipboard. No entourage. She stopped a few feet from the gate and stared at the chain as if it had personally betrayed her. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, careful, the way people sound when they realize certainty was borrowed, not owned. "We're still reviewing," she said. I nodded. "I know." She asked if I had documentation. "Not demanded." Asked. The difference mattered. I handed her copies of the permits and installation records, watching her expression change as she read. Her confidence didn't disappear all at once. It thinned, layer by layer, with every line she couldn't dispute. "This gate predates the HOA?" she asked. "Yes. And ownership was never transferred." "Correct." She exhaled slowly. Around us, the street stayed quiet. Phones were out. No one interrupted. Everyone understood this was the moment where things either escalated or ended. She tried one last angle. "Even so, the community has interests to consider." "I agree," I said. "That's why control has to be legal." She didn't argue. She couldn't. Instead, she stared at the notice bolted to the gate, the same one she'd ordered placed there. It looked different now. Smaller. Less official. Like a mistake that hadn't been cleaned up yet. After a long pause, she reached out and removed it herself. The sound of the bolt loosening was subtle, but the effect was immediate. A neighbor across the street let out a quiet breath. Someone else lowered their phone. The seal stayed. For the moment. But the message was gone. "I'll be in touch," she said, already stepping back. I watched her leave without saying anything else. There was no need. The power shift had already happened. When authority starts undoing its own work, the outcome is no longer in question. I stood by the gate until the street returned to normal rhythm. Then I placed my hand on the metal and waited. The seal wouldn't last the day. And when it came off, everyone would know exactly why. The seal came off that afternoon without ceremony. No announcement. No notice posted. No explanation offered. I wasn't even outside when it happened. A neighbor texted me a single photo, the gate, unchained, standing exactly as it had before, as if the last 2 days had been quietly erased. But nothing had been erased. Everyone had seen too much. I walked out a few minutes later and confirmed it for myself. The chain was gone. The padlock removed. No scratches, no apology note, no sign it had ever been there except for the bolt holes where the notice had been mounted. They hadn't bothered to cover those. Maybe they couldn't. People came out of their houses naturally, like they were responding to a weather change. No one clapped. No one cheered. That would have made it feel like a spectacle. Instead, there was something more powerful in the air, understanding. The HOA president didn't return. No board members appeared. Authority, when exposed, prefers distance. That evening, an email arrived. Short. Carefully worded. It stated that after review, the HOA had determined the gate fell outside its enforcement scope and that access restrictions had been prematurely applied. Not wrong. Not unauthorized. Premature. Language chosen to retreat without admitting fault. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to discuss. Over the next few days, the neighborhood changed in small ways. People asked different questions at the mailbox. They spoke differently at stop signs. HOA emails were read more carefully, forwarded more often, discussed instead of accepted. The gate had become a reference point, even when no one mentioned it. At the next HOA meeting, attendance doubled. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The board answered questions cautiously now, citing documents instead of tone. When someone asked about enforcement limits, the response included phrases like verified ownership and documented authority. Those words hadn't mattered before. Now they did. After the meeting, a neighbor stopped me in the parking lot. "They won't try that again," he said quietly. I nodded. Not like that. That night, I locked the gate the same way I always had. Not to make a point. Not to assert anything. Just because it was mine to lock. The seal had been removed, but something else had been put in its place. A boundary. Clear. Visible. Respected. And once that exists, control no longer needs to announce itself. In the weeks that followed, the gate faded back into the background, but the question it raised did not. It followed conversations, lingered in meetings, and surfaced in places it never had before. The question was simple, almost uncomfortable in its simplicity: who actually owns this? Before the incident, no one asked that. They assumed. Assumptions had been easier than reading, easier than pushing back, easier than slowing things down. The HOA had benefited from that ease for years. Now, ease was gone. I noticed it first in the emails. The language changed. Phrases like required and must quietly disappeared, replaced with please review and pending confirmation. Attachments multiplied. References appeared. Authority began citing sources instead of relying on tone. One afternoon, a neighbor knocked on my door holding a thick folder. She looked almost embarrassed. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Inside the folder were notices she'd received over the years: fines, warnings, compliance letters. She wanted to know if all of them had actually been enforceable. I didn't answer that for her. I showed her where to look. Sections. Clauses. Dates. She left thoughtful, not angry. That was important. Understanding lasts longer than outrage. Others followed. Quiet questions at first, then confident ones. Someone discovered their fence predated HOA rules. Another realized a driveway easement had never been updated. Small details, overlooked for years, suddenly mattered. The HOA responded by slowing everything down. Reviews replaced rulings. Committees replaced decisions. What once moved fast now moved carefully. That wasn't weakness. It was adjustment. They were learning where their lines actually were. At the next meeting, someone asked about access enforcement again. The board chair paused longer than usual before answering. "Only where ownership is clearly established," he said. No one argued. No one needed to. I sat quietly, watching the room absorb that shift. Power hadn't been taken from the HOA. It had been defined. And defined power behaves very differently from assumed power. That evening, I walked the length of the gate and ran my hand along the metal. It felt exactly the same as it always had. The difference wasn't physical. It was shared. The gate had done more than open an entrance. It had opened a question the neighborhood would never stop asking again. Just when it seemed settled, the HOA made one last attempt, careful, almost polite, and intentionally quiet. There were no notices this time. No seals. No public action. Instead, a line appeared deep inside a routine community update email, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. It mentioned standardizing access procedures and hinted at upcoming assessments of privately maintained structures. No threats. Just possibility. That was the pattern now. If power couldn't be asserted openly, it would try to creep back in through language. A week later, a contractor's truck parked near the entrance early in the morning. No logos that screamed HOA. Just a clipboard, a hard hat, and confidence that came from being told the work was approved. He walked straight toward the gate, measuring tape already in hand. I met him halfway. He explained he'd been asked to evaluate compatibility of the locking mechanism with updated community standards. I asked who approved the evaluation. He named the HOA management company, not the board, not legal. A familiar shortcut. I didn't argue. I didn't refuse. I asked him to wait. Then I made one phone call. Not angry. Not urgent. Just factual. I explained exactly what was happening and where the contractor was standing. I referenced the same documentation that had already changed the tone weeks earlier. I didn't accuse anyone. I let the facts speak. The response was immediate. The contractor's phone rang while he was still standing there. He listened, nodded once, and hung up. His posture changed. "I'm not supposed to be here," he said simply. "No," I replied. He packed up without touching the gate. No inspection. No notes. No follow-up. Just a quiet exit. That afternoon, another email arrived. Shorter than the last. It clarified that no evaluations or assessments would be conducted on privately owned access structures without explicit owner consent. No mention of the earlier message. No explanation for the contradiction. Just correction. Neighbors noticed. They always do. The truck. The call. The retreat. The pattern was becoming familiar now. The HOA wasn't trying to take control back. They were testing whether anyone was still paying attention. They were. That night, I locked the gate and stood there for a moment, listening to the normal sounds of the neighborhood returning. Cars. Voices. Wind. The kind of noise that means things are functioning as they should. They wouldn't try again, not because they couldn't, but because they knew what would happen if they did. The real change didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine. A revised HOA guideline was emailed to all residents one morning, buried between landscaping updates and trash pickup reminders. Most people would have skimmed past it. This time, they didn't. The wording was subtle but unmistakable. It clarified that any gate, access point, or structure installed prior to HOA jurisdiction would remain under the exclusive control of its documented owner unless a signed transfer existed. The sentence was careful. Neutral. Final. That sentence hadn't been there before. Neighbors began messaging each other screenshots. No excitement. No celebration. Just recognition. The gate had forced a line to be drawn, and now it was written where it couldn't be ignored. At the next HOA meeting, the room felt different. Quieter, but sharper. The board members spoke slower. They referenced documents instead of expectations. When questions came up about enforcement, they answered with limits instead of assumptions. I noticed something else too. The HOA president wasn't there. Her seat was empty. No announcement was made about it, but by the end of the meeting, everyone understood she wouldn't be coming back. Authority doesn't disappear loudly when it's exposed. It steps aside and hopes no one asks why. After the meeting, a few neighbors lingered in the parking lot. Someone mentioned how things felt balanced now. Another said they'd started rereading their original purchase paperwork for the first time in years. No one mentioned my gate. They didn't need to. It had already done its job. Later that evening, I walked the length of the property and stopped at the entrance. The gate stood open, just as it always had when I allowed it. The metal was cool under my hand. Familiar. Unchanged. What had changed was the understanding around it. The HOA didn't challenge the gate again. They didn't test its lock. They didn't send contractors or follow-up emails. Control had shifted not because someone lost a fight, but because someone proved where the line was. And once a line is proven, crossing it becomes very expensive. I closed the gate gently and locked it from my side. Not for protection. For closure. The seal they'd placed had vanished, but the lesson it created remained, shared now by an entire neighborhood that knew the difference between authority and ownership. Control hadn't been taken from the HOA. It had simply returned to where it belonged. Months passed, and the gate became invisible again. That's how I knew the story had truly ended. Real power doesn't linger in attention, it settles into normalcy. The metal bars still opened and closed the same way, the hinge still made the same quiet sound, but the meaning behind it had changed permanently. The HOA moved differently now. Notices were shorter. Language was cautious. Enforcement emails came with attachments instead of threats. When rules were discussed, they were explained, not assumed. No one ever mentioned the gate directly, but it hovered in every decision like a reminder no one needed spoken aloud. New neighbors moved in that summer. During casual conversations, someone would occasionally ask, "Didn't something happen with access here a while back?" I always gave the same answer. "Everything's sorted now." That was enough. Stories don't need retelling when lessons stick. What stayed with me most wasn't the victory. It was the realization of how easily control had been assumed in the first place. For years, people had confused silence with consent, proximity with ownership, and authority with legitimacy. The gate didn't challenge the HOA, it exposed those assumptions for what they were. I never joined the board. I never tried to change policy directly. I didn't need to. The neighborhood had learned to slow down, to read, to ask before accepting. That shift was quieter than rebellion, but far more durable. One evening, I stood at the entrance longer than usual, hand resting on the cool metal. I thought about how different the outcome might have been if I'd reacted with anger instead of patience, force instead of proof. The situation wasn't resolved by strength. It was resolved by clarity. The HOA never apologized. I never expected them to. What mattered was what they stopped doing. No more overreach. No more testing boundaries without confirmation. No more sealing what they didn't own. The gate still stands, not as a symbol of defiance, but as a quiet marker of understanding. It opens when I allow it. It closes when I choose. And no one questions that anymore. Because everyone knows now. Control isn't claimed. It's proven. And once it's proven, it doesn't need to announce itself ever again.